Chapter 2 introduces how and why sociologists conduct research. In this chapter, students will be able to define social research methods and list the goals of conducting research, to design a research study from its inception to execution, including the write-up and the dissemination of findings, identify research approaches, such as qualitative research, quantitative research, and mixed methods research, differentiate between the ways that conflict theory, feminism, functionalism, and symbolic interactionism approach social research, evaluate different methodological approaches, and weigh their strengths and weaknesses in relation to a sociological study. Also be able to consider the ethical dimensions relevant to setting up a research study. In today's video, we'll talk about 5 things: how we define research methods, the process of research, theoretical approaches to research methods, methods of social research, and the ethics of conducting research. Social research methods include a wide range of techniques for and approaches to learning about the social world through a plan or research design. Research methods are the toolkits that sociologists draw from in order to learn about, understand, and contribute to social life. These can include a number of specific methods like interviews, surveys, ethnographic research, participant observation, statistical analysis, and secondary data analysis, and many others. Proper methodology in research design allows one to accomplish 5 main goals. 1. Describe the characteristics of our society. For instance, through census collection, we can lay out the basic characteristics and demographics of society. It also allows us to make predictions, like how many folks will smoke as adults, to draft smoking prevention policies, for instance. It also allows us to explain relationships, which help us create theories about the world, but not necessarily to influence it. It also allows us to debunk myths, for example, to show that a popular belief or myth is wrong about something, like the long-standing belief that unemployed folks simply lounge around rather than looking for jobs, and to highlight issues relevant to the pursuit of social change and social justice. For example, to understand the experience of marginalized and racialized folks with the goal of achieving some sort of social change. The purpose of using systematic methods to understand the social world is to eliminate bias, or the systematic errors in the process of drawing conclusions from our observations that may lead to inaccurate or imprecise knowledge claims. For example, bias is introduced when any opinion, characteristic, or attitude of a research influences the research process, such as the interpretation of data, for instance. Through careful observation and analysis often over long periods of time and with large groups, sociologists can gain trustworthy and meaningful insights. There are multiple stages to the research process, including identifying an area of inquiry and the state of the literature, developing a useful research question, planning data collection and analysis, and then carrying it out, and once having summarized and assessed the analysis, disseminating it to relevant audiences such as the public, other scholars, and policymakers. The literature helps to obtain a good understanding of what has been studied in the past, what we know and what we do not know about a topic. The literature published on a topic can help formulate a research question in 2 ways. It helps the researcher get a good understanding of what has been studied in the past and relevant research gaps, and the literature can further help clarify significance of the study itself. Researchers use a number of resources to produce their literature review, including academic library catalogs, field-specific databases like JSTOR, internet Google search engines like Google Scholar, and encyclopedias, reference manuals, and handbooks on specific topics. Based on your literature review, you will define a research question. A research question is a well-defined question about the behavior, event, or phenomenon of interest that will be answered throughout the research process. 3 guiding principles form this research question: clarity, or a clear formulation of the research question that is easy to understand; specificity, or the specific formulation of the research question evading the use of vague terminology. And 3, feasibility, or a formulation of the answerable research questions that can be tackled in a single project given all limitations and challenges. For example, a really unclear, non-specific, and unfeasible question would be, why does society change? It is far too broad and not specific enough. The concepts are not well defined. Like, what does society mean? What does change mean in this context? A better question would be something like, how has the demographic makeup of the Canadian population changed over the past 20 years? You could then explore census data to understand how Canadian society has changed from 2000 to today, for instance. A research design is the blueprint or plan of the study, and it is absolutely fundamental and important step in the research process. It defines the study type, research question, hypothesis, variables, data collection methods, and analysis plan. Scholars need to carefully consider their epistemological grounding, or the broad theory of knowledge that they take. How do we know what we know? And examine the criteria determining successful research. These often include reliability, validity, social significance, ethical issues, and potential contributions to knowledge. It is in your research design that you will operationalize your concepts. Operationalization is how you define your abstract theoretical terms. It's the process of measuring and comparing an abstract theoretical concept. For example, how do you operationalize social change? There are a number of ways you can do this: demographic change, cultural change, population size, etc. It is important for you to be very specific in terms of exactly how you define your key concepts. You will also define and operationalize your variables. Variables are measurable attributes of characteristics of your study. For example, in our hypothetical study of social change in Canada, you may have different variables for race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, etc. These can be measured and compared with one another over time to identify trends and patterns. Good research design carefully justifies the decisions made around what data collection method is used, what population is investigated, and how data are analyzed, taking ethics into account throughout the entire process. A pro tip here to help you during your university career: data are always used in the plural, since it refers to the collection of measurements. Data are not used in the singular. This means you refer to data are or data suggest rather than data is or data suggests. A tip a professor once gave me is replace the word data in your papers with the word oranges in your mind and write accordingly. You wouldn't say oranges is, would you? No, you would say oranges are. Use data the same way. After you have identified the research problem, completed your literature review, and developed your research plan, you will move to the data collection stage. This is where you collect the social data to be used in your study. This is typically done qualitatively or quantitatively, or sometimes a mix of both. Quantitative methods rely on numerical values obtained through data collection procedures. For example, most often collected through surveys and experiments. Quantitative data research looks at the relationship between two or more variables, and most often tests a particular hypothesis about that relationship. In this way, it is often referred to as a deductive approach because it tests a particular theory about a relationship. Say that there are significant demographic changes in Canada over the past 20 years. A hypothesis is a prediction, informed assumption, or so-called educated guess about the relationship between two or more variables. This is often measured through correlation, which is a measure of association between two variables, which can either be negative or positive. It is important not to confuse correlation with causation. A correlation does not prove any causal effect, or that one variable causes another. It is simply that two variables move together or in opposite directions. The common example here is that pop-up ice cream sales, shark attacks, and drownings are all heavily correlated with one another. That is, they move together. Ice cream sales go up, shark attacks go up, and drownings all go up at the same time. But is that a causal relationship? No. It's simply that folks are eating more ice cream in the summer, and they're also going swimming in the ocean at the same time. When you collect and analyze data, you need to be keenly aware of two foundational concepts: reliability and validity. Reliability describes the extent to which findings can be replicated and are consistent across comparable situations. Can your findings be generalized or replicated to the population as a whole? Could you replicate your study in other contexts and find similar things? Similarly, if you measure the temperature of liquid several times under identical conditions, the thermometer displays the same temperature. The results are then reliable. Reliability is a fundamental aspect of the research process. The other is validity. This refers to the extent that a concept, idea, or measure accurately represents the real world. Does a measure actually measure what you are intending? You cannot use age, for instance, as a measure of education level. Why? Because a large proportion of folks do not go through the typical educational journey. Similarly, if you change thermometers and change no other conditions, and the temperature suddenly shoots up to 50 degrees each time, it is likely not a valid measure of the true temperature. It may be reliable because each time the temperature is the same, but it is not valid because they are not getting a sort of true value. High reliability is one indicator that a measurement is valid. If a method is not reliable, it is probably not valid as well. The other key types of data collection are qualitative methods, which examine characteristics that cannot be simply reduced to numerical values. They rely on different kinds of data, often making use of interviews, images, social media posts, videos, and narratives instead of numerical numbers. The point of this is to attempt to produce thick descriptions of the social world, or rich accounts, through deep and nuanced engagement. The aim of qualitative work is not to test a hypothesis derived by existing theory per se, like in the deductive approach, but to develop a new theory from data, or what is called an inductive approach. Reliability and validity are not as important in qualitative studies, but rather qualitative researchers work to gain trustworthiness and credibility of their findings through concepts saturization and triangulation. Saturization refers to the point in time when no new insights are gained from initial data. Interviews are time-consuming and cost a lot of money to complete. There's no way we could interview all 38 million Canadians on a given topic. But we could sample 500 of them and interview as many as possible. Saturation is reached when no new insights are coming from the data. Triangulation involves comparing and contrasting data from various sources and allows qualitative scholars to make sense of their data and trustworthiness of their accounts. Triangulation may include other qualitative data sources, such as interviews or other studies. It may also use quantitative studies, like studies based on census data, to identify whether the lived experiences of participants reflect the qualitative reality and quantitative realities of what is being studied. Increasingly, scholars are adopting what's called mixed methods research projects, which are any combination of research methods. It combines the strengths of different data collection and analysis approaches, and may be done using multiple qualitative or quantitative methods, or a combination of both. For example, analyzing census data as well as interview data. This increases the merits of the research, and it provides a sense of internal triangulation to provide a fuller picture of the phenomenon under study, and also deals with a number of challenges of research, including its time and resource consumption. Finally, after you have analyzed the data, you move to the write-up, the scholarly communication and dissemination stage of the research process. You will write up your findings and often present them at academic conferences. Based off the feedback at these conferences, you will then likely submit to academic journals to undergo a process of peer review. the process where other experts, vet your work and evaluate it to ensure that it meets the standards of scholarly research and is internally and externally valid and reliable. Most of the readings you'll have at the 3rd and 4th year level here will be peer-reviewed journal articles that meet these criteria. They are thus thought to be more reliable and valid findings about the social world than, say, your friend sharing an article on Facebook. But a huge part of contemporary academia is now disseminating your work beyond academic audiences. This is often called public sociology, the process where sociologists seek to communicate their scholarship beyond the small circle of sociologists who share expertise and to the broader community to attempt to influence social change via awareness or public policy. I, for example, have a long-standing public sociology campaign. I host a podcast. I have published on harm and exploitation in college athletics in places like Time Magazine, The Guardian, The Daily Beast, and Jacobin, and I'm verified on Twitter. Why do I do this? Because I believe in the power of sociological research to demand and influence social change. There are also a number of theoretical perspectives on the research methods that you must know. Conflict theory approaches focus on inequality and how it might be changed, and are reflective on how knowledge is generated in the first place. Conflict theory focuses on methods that uncover and better understand inequalities in society related to access to resources, power, and privilege. These are often very critical in nature. That is, they explicitly seek to offer deep understandings of power relations that continue to harm vulnerable groups, and towards deep understanding of critical, indigenous, and anti-oppressive approaches. Feminist approaches often try to understand institutions from the inside, as in Canadian sociologist Dorothy Smith's standpoint perspective. Similar to conflict theory, feminist approaches adopt methodologies that uncover inequalities among social groups in society. These approaches more often describe the daily experiences of marginalized social groups such as Black women, Indigenous women, and transgender folks. The standpoint perspective, by example, proposes that we view the world from different social locations depending on our ethnic background, race, social class, status, and other demographic characteristics that describe us and influence us. Structural functionalists look at how institutions reproduce social order and can examine large-scale patterns most often through quantitative data. They often make use of large-scale survey data and analyses to quantify and understand the role of institutions in producing, maintaining, and reinforcing social order. Symbolic interaction is often used participant observation to understand how people make sense of their everyday lives. They often look at how people come to understand the world around them through their interactions with one another. These studies tend to study how meaning is created and contested through social interaction and the role of symbols in meaning making. The nature of a research question will affect research design, and sociologists use various methods to access the social world, including surveys and questionnaires, interviews, fieldwork, participating in what is being studied, and secondary data analysis to answer questions based on existing sets of data. Researchers often coordinate their theoretical framework, data collection, and mode of analysis. The goal of survey research is to gather systematic information on a topic to describe, explain, or influence social phenomena. It collects data through either structured interviews or questionnaires. The questions are often standardized, which reduces potential bias. Answers often consist of predetermined categories, which allow answers to be more easily compared with one another, and data from a large number of responses can be gathered rather easily. Survey research relies on collecting data on a specific population. A population is the complete group of units which the results are to be generalized. In a study exploring first-year experiences of university undergraduates in Canada, the population would be all first-year undergraduates in universities throughout the entirety of Canada. A sample is a smaller unit or subset of a population of interest in a study, reducing the number of participants to a more manageable size. A sample is always smaller than the population. For example, you may sample first-year university students in Ontario to make the study more manageable, rather than exploring all university students in Canada. Doing this, however, will always introduce some sort of bias, so you have to think about that in your research design. Different types of surveys include self-administered questionnaires like a census, which is a recurring and official count of a particular population that is used to systematically gather and record information about the members of a particular population. Alternatively, surveys might be researcher administered, and these might be administered by researchers who ask you a set of questions. Think of when you've been approached outside of a store and asked to respond to a series of questions. A large portion of social scientific research takes place outside of a laboratory. This type of research, broadly defined as field research, involves careful observation of participants in their supposed natural settings, such as schools, hospitals, clubs, sporting events, and other social spaces. Data collection in these sites can include any combination of surveys, interviews, focus groups. Focus groups are moderated group interviews, or participant observations. Participant observation is a strategy where the researcher observes an individual, a group, or a community in order to better understand and become familiar with customs, practices, norms, and values. While this can often yield really useful and interesting results, there's also a chance for bias to be introduced when people under observation start changing their usual or typical behavior because they know that they're being observed. We call this reactivity. Another type of research is ethnography. This involves researchers fully immersing themselves in a setting and observing the participants. Think of the example of Alice Goffman's ethnographic work in Chicago from the textbook. In this study, however problematic that it may be, Goffman immersed herself within low-income racialized communities in Chicago to explore the impact of mass incarceration and policing on the community. Ethnography distinguishes itself from other approaches because of the longer time frame and the nature of the relation between researcher and research participant. For example, U of T sociologist Ju-Young Lee conducted ethnographic research on the underground rap scene in South Central LA in his highly acclaimed book, Blowin' Up. This is a book I highly recommend for students interested in applied ethnographic sociology. Ethnographers rely on multiple methods of data collection to establish a personal understanding of the setting, including participant observation, jottings, interviews, document analysis, archival research, and participatory action research. Participatory action research is one of the most suitable methodologies for conducting research with marginalized and oppressed communities or social groups. In this field research, participants become active collaborators in the research process. They shape the entire research project, from design to dissemination. Participatory action research was used to study the Amjinan First Nation Reserve, which is located in a heavily polluted area near Sarnia, Ontario. Given that Sarnia is an area heavily polluted by commercial interests, much conflict has arisen between Indigenous groups living on the reserve and the Ministry of the Environment. Participatory action research has given vitally important insights into how community members are impacted by environmental harm. One tool used in participatory action research is photo voice, which aims to understand the lived experiences of marginalized groups through their own expression of that experience. Cameras and subsequent photos taken and described by the participants allow them to take control over what stories they wish to share with researchers and how they choose to frame those stories. By virtue, they also allow researchers to gain insight into the perspectives that they might not consider. When working with Indigenous communities, it's important to remember what some sociologists call the 4 R's of Indigenous research. Those are respect, that power and cultural knowledge, cultural protocol, and the authority and expertise of elders and Indigenous community members must always be respected by the researcher. Responsibility, that the researcher is responsible for taking a role as a learner of Indigenous knowledge and taking that seriously, and must be mindful of what readers and other learners can understand. reciprocity, that the researcher's role is to acquire and validate their understanding with indigenous peoples and help translate that knowledge to others, thereby contributing to the cycle of knowledge that passes on from one generation to the next, and reverence, that there must be deep and true respect towards spiritual knowledge and one's spiritual being. Aside from field research, there's also secondary data analysis. This consists of analysis and interpretation of existing data that's previously collected by other scholars, produced by institutions, or created online in a global digital public. Data can be written or visual formats and have been created by either individuals or institutions. For instance, you could look at individual data like Twitter posts or institutional data like government documents. There are a series of advantages and disadvantages to data analysis. Most notably, it's actually relatively cheap and simple to complete. But it also is almost impossible to add data later on in the research process. Given that sociological research is conducted with human participants, there are important ethical considerations grounded in a central principle of informed consent. Informed consent is permission from participants to take part in a research study only after they've received details about it obtained prior to the involvement in the study. To give informed consent, potential research participants must understand the research topic, their role as participant, and their rights as participants. Research should always weigh the cost and benefit of coercion against study objectives, which refers to the use of any measures of persuasion to convince another person to participate in the study. Research must always conclude with a debriefing, which is when, after the completion of the study, scholars inform participants of the real nature of the study and any deception that took place. In order to ensure research is taken up in an ethical and transparent manner, institutions have what are called research ethics boards, or REBs. These are institutional systems for evaluating the ethical soundness of a research project. Every university has them, and they're guided by the Tri-Council policy statement, Ethical Conduct for Research Involving Humans, as well as other relevant regulations, policies, and guidelines. All studies undertaken at institutions of higher education need to be reviewed and approved by an REB, which consists of experts who carefully read and evaluate a study's research design for its ethical soundness. The importance of conducting research ethically is always important, but is particularly pronounced in research with indigenous communities, as they have historically occupied an unjust and subordinate position relative to how research has been conducted. Sociological research can more productively respect participants by attending to these central principles of indigenous research. Research involving indigenous peoples needs to follow an additional set of ethical guidelines. For your read, watch, and respond this week, I want you to select a social problem. Any social problem, like income inequality, racial discrimination, crime, substance abuse, or anything else, and propose a one-sentence research question within that topic. After you have proposed a research question, I want you to describe what the dream sociological study would be to answer your question. Would it be quantitative or qualitative? Would it be a combination of both? Which method would you use? And what are some of the ethical considerations you might think of for your study? Well, that's it for today, and we learned a lot. We learned the definition of social research methods and the goals of conducting research. We learned how to design a research study from inception to execution, beginning with a research problem and proceeding to the literature review, then proceeding to research question, research design, data collection and analysis, and ultimately dissemination. We learned some of the key differences and strengths and weaknesses of quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods approaches. We learned how research is conducted differently in 4 theoretical approaches, and we learned a wide range of methodological approaches. Finally, we learned about the importance of taking ethics into consideration when setting up and conducting a research project. So I hope you learned something about social science research methods. This has been Professor Silva, and I'll catch you on the next episode.